They'll tell you time heals, but there are crimes that don't heal. They ferment quietly in the dark. And sometimes the cruelest part isn't the violence, it's the anonymity that follows. Because on a rain-soaked morning in upstate New York, a man walked into his field expecting nothing but mud and corn stalks and the ordinary ache of work. And instead, he found a girl, face down. No name, no wallet, no one calling her phone. No one racing up the road screaming, "That's my baby!" Just a wet red jacket against wet earth, like a warning flare no one knew quite how to read. She'd been shot, dragged into that cornfield, and shot again. And whoever did it wanted her to disappear. Tonight, darlings, this isn't only the story of a murder. It's a story of a girl whose identity was stolen twice. Once by the person who pulled the trigger, and then by the long bureaucratic silence that followed. This is the unsolved murder of Tammy Jo Alexander. Welcome back to RIP, where we do a deep dive into unsolved murder cases that still haunt and linger and endlessly demand answers. I'm your host, Linzy LeGron, and before we begin, we are endlessly grateful to our show producers, Chicken Wrap Entertainment, whose steady hands and unshakable belief make this show possible. Their care for story, for victims, and for the truth is the spine of RIP. Now, my darlings, this episode is layered. It moves like a long highway at night, stretches of quiet, then sudden headlights. So I'm inviting you to listen like an investigator and feel like a witness. Hold on to the details, clock the contradictions, notice what doesn't fit. And when we reach the end, I want you with me in the comments, your theories, your questions, your instincts. Because this case is still open, and sometimes the smallest memory in the right mind becomes a match in the dark. So let's begin. Caledonia is a small town in upstate New York. Fields, roads, diners, essentially the kind of place where strangers are noticed and yet people can still pass through without leaving a name. On the morning of November 10th, 1979, a local farmer was checking his rain-soaked field near US Route 20 when he saw something in the corn. At first glance, a figure in red, maybe a hunter or a trespasser, but there wasn't any movement. It was absolute, eerie stillness. So, upon further investigation, he found it to be a girl lying face down in the corn stalks and obviously called the police straight away, who further noticed that there was no identification, no purse, no wallet, nothing that said who she was or where she came from. And the weather, darlings, well, that was already working against them. Heavy rain had fallen through the night, and that matters because rain erases. It erases things like footprints, tire tracks, trace evidence on the body, the delicate little whispering clues that tell you which way someone went. Still, investigators began building the first hard outline of what happened. The girl had been shot twice with what would later be identified as a .38 caliber weapon. One shot was to her head, near her right eye. The second was to her upper back. And there was evidence suggesting that she was shot near the roadside first, then dragged roughly 20 feet into the cornfield, and then shot again. And her pockets turned entirely inside out, as if someone rifled through them with purpose, not just theft. Someone was trying to erase her known identity. Beneath her body, investigators recovered a .38 caliber bullet slug, a small, cold piece of certainty from a night that otherwise dissolved into the rain. And then came the question that would haunt Livingston County for decades. Who is she? You see, when a victim is unidentified, the smallest objects become a language all their own. And this girl, this Jane Doe, had a few quiet artifacts on her body that made investigators pause. 2 keychains attached to her belt loops. One was heart-shaped with a keyhole cut out and an inscription that read, "He who holds the key can open my heart." The other keychain was the matching key, naturally. Really cheap trinkets, the type that you would buy without thinking, or you would keep because someone gave them to you, or because you like the feeling of being wanted. Either way, investigators were able to trace those keychains to vending machines along the New York State Thruway, suggesting that she'd traveled that route. Recently enough, at least, that those little charms were still with her. She also wore a delicate silver necklace with 3 small turquoise stones, sort of southwestern in feel. Not impossible to find in New York, but unusual enough in rural Caledonia to raise a question. Was she from far away? And then there was her clothing. Tan corduroy pants, a multicolored plaid shirt, blue knee-high socks, brown shoes with rippled soles, and the most striking piece, a red windbreaker jacket, men's style, with black stripes down the sleeves. Eye-catching, memorable, almost cinematic against the muted browns of a November field. But her pockets held no information, no identification, no name or address. Someone clearly wanted her to be a ghost. In the early parts of the investigation, there was one lead, one flicker of human memory almost immediately. You see, a coroner noted that there was in the victim's stomach a meal eaten not long before her death. And it appeared to be the kind of food you'd get in a small diner late at night. And then, a waitress in the nearby area believed she had served the girl on the night of November 9th, 1979, around 11:30 p.m., which tracks with the known timeline. Most notable, the girl wasn't alone. She was with an older male companion who paid for the meal. The waitress didn't report anything overtly alarming at the time. They seemed like any other pair grabbing a late dinner. But in retrospect, it becomes one of the most chilling, ordinary moments in true crime. A man buys a teenage girl dinner, and within an hour, she's dead in a cornfield. The witness gave police a description of the man. A white male, approximately 5'8" to 5'9", curly hair, black wire-rimmed glasses, and he drove a tan station wagon. Naturally, a composite was created, and alerts went out everywhere. In essence, they had thrown a net over the entire region, because if this man was the last person seen with her alive, he wasn't just a witness. He was the gravitational center of the case. And yet, he was never, ever identified. Not then, not now. Which is inconceivable. It's very hard to imagine, but it is unfortunately true. Now, in the early days, investigators did what they could. They turned, the body into a profile. She was estimated to be between 13 and 19 years old. Later understood to be a 16-year-old teenager. She was petite, around 5'3", roughly 115 to 120 pounds. And there were details that felt out of place for upstate New York in November. For example, very definitive tan lines, really distinct ones, like a halter top or a bikini. Not the kind you'd get from a late autumn sun in Caledonia, that's for sure. This suggested that she'd been in a warmer climate fairly recently. Her hair was light brown, wavy, shoulder length with highlights that looked a few months old. No tattoos, no obvious healed fractures. In essence, no medical breadcrumbs for them to go on. But her dental condition did suggest limited dental care, noting untreated cavities and things of that nature. And that's sort of a roughness that often points to poverty, instability, or, for a young person, a life lived without consistent adult protection. Of course, the natural next step was to submit her fingerprints to a national database, but unfortunately there was no match, no record of her. And so the case became a paradox. A young girl, clearly real, clearly lived and murdered in our country long before her time, and yet somehow she was entirely unrepresented and unregistered in the places we expect people to exist. They circulated photos, they circulated sketches, they checked missing persons reports across New York and beyond. Nothing. As is so likely to happen in a case like this, days became weeks and weeks became years. And eventually the community did what communities sometimes do when the living fail. They buried her with dignity, with a headstone, and with an enduring promise. We'll never forget. One of the most important forces in this story is really not a suspect, it's persistence. The persistence of the community, the persistence of the Livingston County investigators who worked this case for decades, tracking leads, chasing sightings, mailing flyers across the United States and beyond. And remember, this is an area long before centralized digital systems. This work was slow and grueling. This was in the 80s and 90s. It was truly like searching for a needle in a haystack by candlelight. And as one would expect over the years, tips poured in by the thousands. Rumors about truck stops, rest areas, diners, and gas stations. Some truckers reported seeing a teen hitchhiking around that period, fueling a theory that she was traveling through New York on rides from strangers. But without a name, these sightings remained insignificant shadows. The case became one of the most extensive in the country's history, and still, no one stepped forward to say, "That's my Tammy," or "That's my sister," or "That's my friend." And so the question of who she was curdled into something darker. Was nobody looking for her? Why was nobody looking for her? Or was she looked for and simply never entered into the systems that would have connected the dots? Hold on to that, because that very failure becomes the key to a future breakthrough. As the years passed without identification, investigators did what they have to do in cold cases. They broadened the search. They looked at known offenders. They looked at traveling predators. They looked at the era itself, the late 1970s, a time when hitchhiking was common and the interstate highway really created this kind of system or pipeline of danger. And as often happens, famous monsters tried to step in and claim responsibility for the story. There were notorious serial offenders and serial killers that claimed, to be involved or claimed responsibility, but their confessions on the surface seemed to fit, but they really didn't fit all the way. Some killers confess for attention, for leverage, for a feeling of power, significance, or relevance. Some are fed details intentionally or accidentally and then recite them back like a performance. And this matters, darlings, because false confessions create noise. And noise steals time and attention away from victims. This case would carry that kind of noise for years. And the truth is, the murder of this girl did not need mythology. It needed the basics. A name, a trail, a real suspect. And for a long time, investigators had none of those. And then science enters the room. You see, decades after the murder, investigative tools have started to change. It's now the mid-2000s, and advances in forensics opened a door that hadn't existed in 1979. Her remains were exhumed for advanced testing, DNA extraction, and additional analyses that could hint at where she'd been. One major technique involved pollen, of all things, microscopic grains trapped in clothing fibers. Pollen can be a map. It's not precise like GPS, but it's suggestive, and certainly worth exploring in a case with as few leads as this one had. Testing found pollen types that implied she may have spent time in warmer regions, places far from upstate New York, strengthening what the tan lines already had hinted at. She hadn't been local. There were also isotropic analyses, which are chemical signatures in teeth and bones, influenced by regional water and diet. Another whisper pointing south or west were these isotropic analyses. Investigators additionally worked with facial reconstructions and new imagery, trying to capture her as she might have looked in life. Gradually and gratefully, her case moved online into public databases where internet sleuths could finally compare, cross-reference, and connect. And that's when something rare happened. The internet, often chaotic, sometimes even cruel, became an unwitting bridge. You see, the identification of Caledonia Jane Doe did not come from a confession. It came from someone remembering. Years after her murder, a woman began searching for a high school friend whom she had lost touch with, Tammy Jo Alexander from Florida. She couldn't find her, so she reached out to Tammy's family, specifically her half-sister, and she discovered something devastating and enraging. Tammy had been missing for decades, and yet there was no official missing person record. No active report in the system, no digital footprint that could ever have matched this Jane Doe in New York to Tammy. So, in essence, all ties had effectively vanished from a bureaucratic standpoint, from a procedural standpoint. And so a new missing person report was filed decades late, and Tammy's information entered into national systems and databases. And then, an extraordinary moment of recognition. A volunteer who had been deeply familiar with the Caledonia Jane Doe case saw Tammy's photo and felt a click of certainty, a resemblance too strong to ignore. Authorities collected DNA from Tammy's family, and in January 2015, DNA confirmed the truth. Caledonia Jane Doe, unidentified for over 35 years, was Tammy Jo Alexander, a 16-year-old who had disappeared from Florida in 1979. In 2015, her name came back to her. A restoration, a kind of resurrection. But naming her didn't solve her murder. It simply, finally, gave the investigation a doorway into her life. Who she knew, where she'd been, what patterns might have led her to that diner in New York. And now the case became what it should have always been. Not who is she, but who killed Tammy Jo Alexander. So with Tammy's identity confirmed, investigators could finally begin reconstructing her last months. They knew she had a history of running away. They knew she sometimes hitchhiked. They knew she had ties to truck stop life, proximity to the moving artery of the road. They also began looking at places she'd spent time, programs, institutions, communities, trying to identify men who might have crossed her path and had, some motive to harm her. In later investigative steps, authorities identified multiple persons of interest known to Tammy in the past and collected DNA, working to compare it against male DNA recovered from evidence. Naturally, some comparisons ruled individuals out, progress that narrows even when it disappoints. And they leaned into modern forensic genealogy, because when the suspect is unknown and decades have passed, DNA may be the only witness that doesn't forget. Meanwhile, one central figure remains: the man from the diner. Curly hair, wire-rimmed glasses, tan station wagon. If you know him, if you ever knew a man who fit that description and traveled that corridor of the country in 1979, your memory may matter far more than you realize. There's something heartbreakingly intimate about Jane Doe cases. The violence is one horror, but the anonymity is quite another. Because anonymity suggests abandonment, even when it's not true. And yet, Caledonia did not abandon her. They buried her. They kept her grave tended. They kept her case alive. They treated her as someone worth time, money, and memory. When she was identified, it didn't just connect New York to Florida, it stitched together two types of grief. A community that had adopted a nameless girl in death, and a family that had lived decades with uncertainty, assumptions, and silence. This case is also a warning about systems. When a missing person isn't entered properly, when a report disappears into bureaucracy, when a family elects not to file a missing persons report because this is just something she does, cases don't connect. Identifications don't happen. And killers get to keep walking. Tammy deserved far better than that. Now we're going to discuss some theories. So darlings, this is where we step rather lightly. We're not here to cosplay certainty, but we can map plausible lanes based on what we know. So theory one is that this was a traveling predator. The diner sighting, the highway proximity, the out-of-town feel. This theory suggests Tammy met someone on the road who made a quick, lethal decision. The pocket rifling supports either robbery or removal of ID, but the choice to shoot twice, one close-range shot and then one in the back, can also read as control, anger, or fear of recognition. Theory two is that Tammy's killer was someone that she trusted briefly. People often assume hitchhiking victims were naive. Often they were not. They were skilled at reading situations until they met someone who could perform, safe long enough to get close. Basically, someone who bucks the trend. In this case, buying dinner is intimacy. It's not romantic, it's strategic. It lowered her defenses. It normalizes the ride. It makes the next hour feel survivable. And so perhaps this was someone that she was hitchhiking with and she elected to trust when that wasn't the right decision. Finally, theory three is that this was a local encounter. This is a less popular theory, but always possible, that the man wasn't passing through at all, that he was regional, familiar with that road, familiar with places where a body might be found immediately, and probably familiar with the type of people who lived there and could see that she was from someplace else. The problem is, without a name for the man, all theories are haunted by the very same thing, a missing identity, not Tammy's, but his. So as it relates to my personal theory, when I listen to this case, I hear two stories braided together. One is violence, a girl shot, dragged, and then shot again in a cornfield. The other is disappearance. Her pockets turned out, her name removed, her existence erased from the systems that could have found and identified her. And that second story, darlings, helped the first one get away with itself. My personal theory is simple and it's brutal. The killer was counting on her being unmissed. Not unloved, unmissed. He counted on the instability of her past, and we all know how police oftentimes treat a missing persons case if the person has run away in the past. This person was also counting on bureaucracy and the failure of those systems, especially in 1979. They certainly were not as good or comprehensive as they are today. This person was also counting on a girl whose life had had enough fractures that her absence could be misfiled as, oh, she ran away again. And I think he was right for decades. But the thing about time is this: it also exposes, it connects, it brings new tools, new eyes, new databases, new courage. Tammy got her name back, and now the killer needs to lose his. So if you have any information about the homicide of Tammy Jo Alexander, you can contact the FBI toll-free tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can also reach out to the Livingston County Sheriff's Office tip line, which is 1-844-LCSO-TIP. Additionally, you can submit an anonymous tip online through the FBI tip portal, and it turns out the FBI is offering a reward up to $20,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible for Tammy Jo's death. You see, Tammy Jo Alexander was 16, and she was not a symbol. She was not a cautionary tale. She was not a Jane Doe. She was a person, a girl who deserved to be protected by family, by our systems, our cultural systems, and by the world at large. And instead, she was met by someone who treated her life like something disposable. But she wasn't disposable. Caledonia proved that. Florida proved that. The people who kept looking proved that. And now, darlings, it's our turn to prove to our devotion by refusing to let her go on with an unsolved case, by refusing to let this killer win. If you know anything, say it. And if you don't, then remember her name anyway, Tammy Jo Alexander. Until next time, keep your lanterns close, and as always, rest in peace.